In this lecture, we'll begin to examine the sorts of groups that people form, one with another, that help them to navigate their way through life. Gender is technically a kind of social group since men are considered to have different identities than women and vice versa, but we tend to think of gender as more individual and personal. Today's topic, kinship, deals with groups more explicitly. Kinship is the relationship one shares with one's relatives, and kinship calculation is the set of rules that allow one to determine who his or her relatives are. Like most cultural traits, kinship calculation varies widely from one culture to another. Because kinship is such an important organizing principle in many societies, in fact, in many the most important, kinship studies have traditionally been one of the central foci of anthropology. In anthropological discussions of kinship, you'll often see diagrams like this. These kinship diagrams are an abbreviated way of showing complex kinship relationships using only a few symbols. Triangles represent males or men, depending on context. Circles represent females or women. Equal signs represent marriages. Vertical lines connect parents and children, and horizontal lines connect siblings. Different kinds of shading can represent individuals who belong to different kinship groups. And because a lot of kinship relationships change depending on whom one is talking about, one person is often designated as ego. That's Latin for I, and it simply denotes whose relationships are being investigated. So on this chart, person 24 is ego's male sibling or brother, and person 23 is ego's female sibling or sister. Persons 15 and 16 are ego's parents. Before we can begin talking in much detail about kinship, however, we should address a related feature, residence. With whom do you live? Since people you live with are the ones you'll interact with the most, and since kinship is the most important social principle in many societies, it makes sense that kinship and residence are closely related. Households are co-residential economic and social units. The members pool resources, labor, and time to the benefit of all, with exchanges among household members typically taking the form of positive reciprocity. If it's in the household refrigerator, you can eat it, even if you didn't bring it home from the store yourself. Households are not necessarily made up of kin, but in most cases they are. The rules about how a particular household is formed are tied closely to marriage patterns, which we'll look at more closely next time. Generally, when a marriage is formed, the makeup of at least one household will change. Your book discusses 4 patterns of postmarital residence. Patrilocal, where the wife goes to live with her husband, who continues to live in or near his father's house. Matrilocal, where the husband goes to live with his wife, who continues to live in or near her mother's house. Ambilocal, which is either patrilocal or matrilocal, but it varies from one married couple to the next. And neolocal, where both the husband and wife leave their parents' homes and establish their own independent household. Why these different residence patterns appear in any given culture is not always particularly clear. Patrilocal and matrilocal residence may be the result of, or the cause of, patrilineal or matrilineal kinship, which I'll get to in a minute. Ambilocal and neolocal residence are fairly easily understood, however. For the most part, neolocal residence only ever occurs in commercial economies, where the newly established household is able to purchase its needs at market, rather than relying on the reciprocal aid of relatives. In non-commercial economies, the reciprocal aid of kin is essential for the family to survive. So neolocal residence, as we practice in our society, can only make economic sense in a commercial economy. Ambilocal residence is usually only found in non-commercial economies that require great flexibility, such as hunter-gatherers in very marginal environments, or societies that have just experienced large population crashes due to warfare or epidemic. With a rigid residential rule, some newly married couples may not have enough of the right kind of kin. The family can't form an economically viable household, so the new couple moves into the other person's parents' house. Kinship is the extension of family relationships beyond the nuclear family. The nuclear family is exactly what it seems to be, the nucleus of all human genealogy. A nuclear family consists of a father, mother, and their children. No one of those social statuses exists independently of the others. You cannot be a father without there being children involved. And a father cannot have children without those children also having a mother. Of course, the individuals having those statuses may be deceased, absent, or unknown, but they always exist. Since the children of one nuclear family unit may be the parents in another nuclear family unit, nuclear families are linked together into larger groups, and that sort of linkage is called kinship. How those nuclear units get linked together, and which links are considered valid, is kinship calculation. Throughout their lives, most people will belong to at least two nuclear family units. The family of orientation is the nuclear family in which ego holds the child status. It consists of ego, ego's parents, and ego's siblings. On reaching adulthood, ego will likely form a family of procreation in which he or she plays the role of parent. This family consists of ego, his or her partner, but not necessarily spouse, and their children. In a patrilocal society, a woman leaves the household of her family of orientation upon marriage. Her family of procreation will reside in the household of her husband's family of orientation. For the man in a patrilocal society, both of his nuclear families will reside in the same household, aside from married sisters. The reverse is true in a matrilocal society. And in a neolocal society, individuals' two nuclear families always reside separately. Not all societies form households around nuclear families. For example, among the Nair of southwestern India, spouses reside separately and fathers play hardly any role in the raising of their biological children. Mothers play a role in the lives of their children, but no more important of a role than aunts, grandmothers, etc. Thus, the father, mother, son, daughter nucleus is broken up. In other circumstances, biology and social responsibilities may not line up. It's useful to distinguish between the person who donated DNA to a child and the person who acts as a parent to the child. Just as we distinguish between biological sex, that is male-female, and cultural gender, man and woman, anthropologists distinguish between the genitor-genitrix, the male and female biological forebears, respectively, and the pater-mater, the man and woman who serve as socially recognized parents, respectively. In English, both sets of people can be referred to as parents and father or mother. This is because traditionally in Western culture, the genitor and the pater have been the same person, as have the genitrix and mater. This is not always the case, however. For adopted children, for example, the genitor and genitrix are often called birth parents, while the pater and mater are called adoptive parents. Okay, so now it's time to start thinking about how nuclear families get linked into larger social groupings. Not every genealogical link between nuclear families is considered important. Sometimes, even though there is a valid biological connection, the culture will ignore it, breaking the connection between those two groups of people. The rules for how to link nuclear families together create descent groups, large groupings of people who share a common ancestry according to some specified rule. Because every culture recognizes many different rules for descent, there are many different descent groups in any given culture. Some are larger, some are smaller, but how important that group is to the daily lives of its members can vary. The primary rule of descent in most societies is unilineal. A child belongs to the family line of only one of his or her parents. Relatives of the other parent are recognized as relatives. I mean, people aren't silly enough to deny all relationships altogether. But the relationships with those relatives are much less important socially. The descent group to which one belongs, and from which one derives his social identity, is the same as only one parent. The two basic kinds of unilineal descent are patrilineal and matrilineal. Patrilineal descent is where children belong to their father's family, regardless of their own gender. In this diagram, you see that persons 4 and 5 both inherit the same lineal identity from their father, person 1. Person 4, one's son, passes the same identity on to his children 8 and 10. But person 5, the daughter, does not pass that identity on to her children 12 and 14. They inherit their lineal identity from their own father, person 6. Matrilineal descent is the flip side. Children belong to their mother's family regardless of their own gender. In this scenario, 4 and 5 inherit from their mother, person 2. Daughter 5 passes on the identity to 12 and 14, but 8 and 10 do not inherit their identity from their father, number 4. Instead, they inherit from their own mother, number 3. In patrilineal societies, both sons and daughters belong to the dad's family, not mom's. There is no society that I know of where the child's gender plays a role in descent so that brothers and sisters would belong to different descent groups. There is another kind of unilineal descent, but it's rarer. Ambilineal descent is where the child or someone else, such as the parents, chooses which family he or she belongs to. This type of descent goes along with ambilocal residence. It tends to happen in societies that require greater flexibility. By relaxing the rules a bit and allowing people to choose whom they associate with, people are able to establish functional kinship networks where they might not have had any. Unilineal descent often seems odd to Americans because American society does not operate according to a unilineal descent rule. We practice bilateral descent, where relatives on both the mother's and father's side are of equal importance. On holidays, for example, we expect to celebrate with both sides of the family, and we call relatives of both parents by the same kinship terms. Because relationships go in both directions, the only people in a bilateral descent society who have the same relatives are siblings. Your cousins have cousins who are not your cousins. In a unilineal kinship society, they are. So, in a bilateral descent society, there aren't clear-cut descent groups that divide the society into parts, but a whole continuum of overlapping kindreds, each comprised of the relatives of a single ego. Let's go back to unilineal kinship societies then. They divide the society into several non-overlapping parts. Everyone either belongs to a particular descent group or they do not. And since all the memberships are determined by parent-child relationships, everyone who belongs to a particular group shares a common ancestor, called the apical ancestor, because he or she stands at the apex of a genealogical chart. These unilineal descent groups are very important for structuring the social relations of most societies around the world, and they take on several different forms. For example, lineages are groups of nuclear families descended from a known common ancestor according to a unilineal rule, very similar to an extended family, only larger. In Kinship terminology, they tie people together through demonstrated descent. Precise genealogical relationships can be demonstrated between any two lineage members. They're either matrilineages or patrilineages, depending on how the relationships to the common ancestor are calculated. On this chart, the apical ancestor of the blue patrilineage would be the father of persons 10, 11, and 12. The apical ancestor of the red matrilineage would be the mother of persons 1, 2, and 3. Of course, if a culture follows a patrilineal rule, then patrilineages will be present. Patrilineages aren't important in cultures that follow a matrilineal rule, and vice versa. Lineages may also be combined into larger groups called clans. Clans are groups thought to have descended from an apical ancestor, but they rely on stipulated descent. Precise genealogical relationships cannot be demonstrated, but they're assumed to exist. Clans may be lineages where the common ancestor is just so far removed in time that his or her identity has simply been forgotten. Or it may be that no common ancestor ever actually existed, but living members of the clan believe that such an ancestor existed. Clans are also almost always named, usually after animals. The name of a clan is called its totem. In many societies, for example Native American tribes, the totem is believed to be the common ancestor, so that everyone in the Bear clan is thought to descend from the primeval Ancient of Bears, a bear deity that participates in important tribal myths. The famous totem poles of the Pacific Northwest are actually visual representations of the clans living in the local town and their totems. Another unilineal group is the moiety. Moieties are often made by combining clans into even larger categories, just as clans are often combinations of lineages. Moieties divide the society in half, for example between sky clans and earth clans. Because clans rely on stipulated descent and moieties are combinations of clans, moieties also rely on stipulated descent. Moiety systems, if they exist in a society, are important because they regulate marriage. A person's spouse must belong to the opposite moiety. Because every marriage is to a spouse from the other moiety, and because every child will belong to one moiety or the other, the two groups remain roughly equal in size. Okay then, let's talk about matrilineal societies. Worldwide, they are relatively rare compared to the much more common patrilineal pattern. This is probably because of the unusual stresses created for men living in such a society. In a patrilineal society, descent is through the male line, and the senior males in the patrilineage exercise political power. Fathers and grandfathers are the ones in charge of making decisions for the lineage, so there's relatively little stress involved. Matrilineal societies structure themselves around descent through women. Membership in lineages and clans is determined by who one's mother is, and everyone in a lineage or family is descended from a single woman. But as we discussed before, women do not typically exercise political power, even in matrilineal societies. The senior men in the matrilineage, the oldest men in the oldest surviving generation, typically are the ones who hold leadership positions and make political decisions for the group. A child's father is not a member of the child's lineage, but something of an outsider. Since the lineage is usually the basic social and economic unit in these societies, this means that a child's father is not in charge of making decisions for the child. Since the child is the future of the lineage, and the father is not even a member of that lineage, he has little right to make those big decisions that shape the child's future. So who does? Usually that responsibility falls to the child's mother's oldest brother. Matrilineal descent creates a situation that's pretty odd to our way of thinking. A child's father does belong to the child's family of orientation, but not to the child's lineage. He generally has a rather limited role in child rearing. The child's mother's brother is the most closely related male in the parent's generation. So the maternal uncle becomes closely involved in the raising of his sister's children. In the next generation, the man's sister's son will become one of the senior males of the lineage and must be trained in the skills necessary to lead the group. So the mother's brother's sister-son relationship is particularly close in a matrilineal society. This is called the avuncular relationship. And the avuncular relationship has some consequences for residence patterns. First, most matrilineal societies are also matrilocal. We see here an unmarried brother and sister living in their mother's home. The brother will eventually marry a woman of a different lineage, a practice called exogamy that we'll discuss more next time. Since this is a matrilocal society, when he marries, he'll move out of his mother's home and move in with his wife. His wife's brother will belong to the red lineage, but will live in a different household. Meanwhile, his sister will have married a husband from a different lineage, who now lives in the gray household. Both married couples will eventually have children. Square symbols here indicate that the gender of the child is not important. So this diagram shows who resides in which household. Meanwhile, this chart shows the avuncular relationships that describe each man's child-rearing responsibilities. If we combine those last two charts, we see the problem. The man in the gray lineage lives in the red household, but he must be closely involved in the raising of children who live in the gray household. Meanwhile, his own red child is being raised by his red brother-in-law who lives in some third household. The logistics of navigating these conflicting familial and kinship responsibilities can be very stressful for men in matrilineal societies. In addition to that, women in matrilineal societies are the social and economic core of the matrilineage, so they have much more secure economic positions. The combination of those two factors means that divorce is much more common in matrilineal societies. Married men are stressed, and women can get along without husbands, so why stay together? Finally, kinship terminology, the linguistic dimensions of kinship. Every kinship system requires some way of designating different kinds of kinship relationships. Kinship terminology is a system of terms in their native language that members of a cultural group use to address their kin. Kinship terminology is emic, whereas all the terms we've discussed so far in this lecture are etic. To determine which kinship term is used, we trace a line from ego, the person who would use a given term to reference a kin, to the alter, the kin to whom a kin term would be applied. Kinship terms are egocentric because the identity of ego changes which term will be used. On this diagram, ego 1 would address alter as uncle, but ego 2 would address that same person as brother. Kinship terminology always lumps certain kinds of kin relationships together under the same term, while differentiating other relationships with their own labels. Which genealogical relationships get lumped together, and which get their own unique kin term, depends on the social relationships involved and the descent system in place. Your textbook uses the example of how kin terms designate the parent's generation to demonstrate how different kinship terminology systems work. So, for example, the English word uncle applies to ego's father's brother and to ego's mother's brother. Uncle could therefore be defined as parent's brother. Aunt applies to both ego's father's sister and ego's mother's sister, which means that its definition is parent's sister. This is called lineal kinship terminology. Because our descent rule is bilateral, our kin terms do not differentiate mother siblings from father siblings. Both kinds of kin are supposed to be equally important. On the other hand, our residence pattern is neolocal, So mother and father both live in Ego's household and play a much more important role in his life while growing up. We thus differentiate mother from aunt and father from uncle using 4 terms total. In a patrilineal patrilocal society, both Ego's father and Ego's father's brother live in the same household and play major roles in raising him or her. They're thus referred to by the same term, a word that doesn't mean father or uncle, but rather something more like man in the same lineage as me and my parents' generation. Mother and mother's sister are equally socially distant to Ego, so they also get lumped together. The same patterns can be seen in matrilineal societies. And this is called bifurcate merging terminology. It bifurcates or splits the parents' lines, but it merges same-gender siblings of each parent. There are still 4 terms, but they're distributed differently. In generational terminology, there are only 2 terms for the parents and their siblings. All men are referred to by one term, and all women by another. This is associated with ambilineal descent, since either the mother's lineage or the father's lineage may be important, or the importance may shift. Both sides are treated interchangeably. Finally, bifurcate collateral terminology uses 6 terms to refer to Ego's parents and siblings. Every genealogical relationship gets its own unique term. This is very rare, probably because it's so complicated. It likely arose because of unique historical circumstances in the few related cultures that use it. So what can we get from this? Kinship terminology can seem like ethnographic nitpicking, especially when you consider that these 4 patterns couple with 6 patterns that describe terms for Ego's own generation. Certainly, understanding kin terms is important for the ethnographer trying to understand a particular culture. What does it offer to the ethnologist trying to understand culture more generally? Well, note that each of these terminological patterns matches a specific descent rule, and each descent rule fits with a particular kind of residence or marriage pattern. Since culture is integrated, and since each institution is functionally interrelated, these kinds of nitpicky language studies can actually reveal deeply important principles that underlie every social interaction. By learning how people address their relatives, you can start guessing at their kinship, residence, economy, even politics. Now, a couple times during this lecture, we've touched on marriage. In the next lecture, we'll wrap up our 2nd unit by focusing on marriage in detail and seeing how it functions to tie people into even larger networks of relationships.